A Biden administration DOJ operation allowed hundreds of thousands of fentanyl pills to flow into New Mexico. This was revealed by a whistleblower, and that whistleblower has been represented by Tristan Leavitt with Empower Oversight. He's here with us today to explain this operation and also how it very much resembles an operation that happened during the Obama administration. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. So wanted to talk to you about DEA Special Agent David Howell. He's the one who made a protected whistleblower complaint to start with. That goes all the way back to 2023. Could you talk a little bit about how you first came to be involved in this case and how you came to know him?
Yeah, absolutely. So Special Agent Howell is based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And as you mentioned, in 2023, he filed his whistleblower complaint. He went to a couple of different places. Ultimately, the Office of Special Counsel, an agency that I used to work at, took up his complaint and required that the Justice Department produce a report. Skipping forward, when he got the results of that and he believed that there would still be a lot of public interest, he saw the parallels to Operation Fast and Furious, the ATF operation of 15 years ago. And Empower's founder, Jason Foster, and I both investigated that case for Senator Chuck Grassley's Senate Judiciary Committee. And so Special Agent Howell reached out to John Dodson, the original ATF whistleblower in Fast and Furious, and through him got in touch with us. And that's how we first learned David's story and decided to start representing him.
Okay, got it. All right. So you said that Mr. Howell has faced retaliation after he made the complaint. Could you explain a little bit about what happened to him and what type of retaliation?
Yeah, so there's really kind of two different stages of his whole experience. The first kind of the retaliation coincides with his initial disclosures. He had a couple of different cases where they were up on a federal wiretap. You have to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office to do that. The U.S. Attorney's Office in any state is receiving guidance from the Criminal Division at Justice Department headquarters in Washington, D.C. And so going through that process, they were monitoring individuals they believed were trafficking fentanyl. They became aware of imminent fentanyl sales and distribution. And on the first one of these, Special Agent Howell and his partner seized that fentanyl and really got chastised by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And after that initial conversation, Special Agent Howell started looking closer at what was behind this from the U.S. Attorney's Office and started to realize that other cases also were instances where the U.S. Attorney's Office was directing that fentanyl not be seized. And so in these cases, he started to see a pattern, and that's what led him to both speak up to the U.S. Attorney's Office, but also to prepare to file whistleblower complaints. Ultimately, just in that year of 2023, the U.S. Attorney's Office became more and more upset with his making these disclosures, and ultimately they told the DEA in New Mexico they would no longer work with Special Agent Howell. They refused to take any of his cases. And for a federal agent, that's really kind of a death knell to your career. We saw a very similar thing with the IRS agents on the Hunter Biden case, where the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware refused to work with them. And the Office of Special Counsel specifically found that even though they don't work for the Department of Justice, DOJ can be considered to have retaliated by refusing to work with someone. And so that really set off the chain of dominoes that has impacted David's career since then of, if he's not able to do normal DEA work, being detailed to other agencies, going through just kind of a series of makeshift work assignments to get around the fact that he couldn't do his normal work as an officer if you're not ever allowed to testify in a case, a trial, or even to have a case of yours brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Okay, right. Yeah, and let's talk about a little bit of the Fast and Furious case going all the way back to the Obama administration. You were part of Senator Grassley's staff during that. This has been called, there's been some headlines and so forth, the fentanyl Fast and Furious. It's been called Fast and Furious 2.0. A lot of people don't remember Fast and Furious because it did happen so long ago. Could you talk a little bit about that, about the parallels between this issue and just basically fentanyl walking and the gun walking in those two cases? And do you think in some ways this might be worse than Fast and Furious?
Sure. So Operation Fast and Furious was an ATF case, and it utilized this tactic of walking, in this case guns, walking just means anytime there are illicit materials that law enforcement doesn't seize when they have the opportunity and could have otherwise. So in Operation Fast and Furious, ATF was somewhat responding to criticism that they had not done enough to dismantle overall firearms trafficking networks. And I think you see a similar issue here where there was this desire to take down overall fentanyl trafficking networks rather than just, taking off individual loads. ATF at the time described that to us as whack-a-mole. I've heard here in the fentanyl context, former Biden U.S. Attorney Alex Ubaez described it a similar way with fentanyl. But in both cases, there was really a shortfall and a real short-sightedness in not believing that they could kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. So in Fast and Furious, even though they were up on a wiretap and they knew when guns were being trafficked, their idea was just to allow the guns to be trafficked because they believed that would somehow help them to identify more of the network of where the guns were going south. And ultimately, as guns were recovered south of the border at murder scenes and other crime scenes, they were traced back to the U.S. and they pinged off of the Fast and Furious database being kept by ATF in Arizona. And that's how they knew that these guns were being used, by exactly the people they wanted to target. But they had no effective mechanism for monitoring the guns on the way down or stopping the bad things they might do. And so it led really kind of to two parallel criticisms. One, that the ATF and the U.S. Attorney's Office that they were working with really were not properly weighing the risks to public safety. ATF would point to DEA and say, well, they walk things as well, but, allowing a load of marijuana or even of something like cocaine to go unseized doesn't have the immediate deadly effect that firearms, and now in this case, fentanyl, can have. So, again, a lot of criticism of that trade-off. The second thing was that a criticism that Justice Department headquarters didn't do enough to stop this. To have a federal wiretap approved, you first have to go through this process within the criminal division of the Department of Justice. And so they were getting insights into these local cases, seeing, reading these affidavits about the immense numbers of guns, and again, in this case, fentanyl that's going, and really aware of what was happening. So one of the takeaways from Operation Fast and Furious was that DOJ adopted a firearms violence protocol saying, if you are up on a wiretap and you become aware of, of imminent trafficking of firearms, of violence that can come from that, you need to seize those as soon as possible, wherever practicable. And then in 2019, the Trump Justice Department adopted a similar protocol for fentanyl, saying, we recognize how deadly fentanyl is. Unlike other drugs, if you are up on a wire and you become aware of fentanyl trafficking or of places where fentanyl is being stored, you need to make every effort to seize that fentanyl. So, in both cases, again, this motivation to try and by not seizing it, to not burn the wiretap, to not alert the criminals that you have it, but not being willing to take other intermediate steps, like having local law enforcement do a traffic stop where they might seize it, which wouldn't alert the criminals to the fact that there is a federal wiretap up. If it seems like someone's just saying, hey, seem like you're driving a little fast, or you've got a tail light out here. So, the whistleblowers in both cases said, no, there are ways to not burn the wire, but still stop the bad things from going out into the community. To the question about which is worse, a lot of people are unaware that, again, many people died from the Fast and Furious firearms. Most Americans didn't become aware of that until a U.S. Border Patrol agent was shot and killed, and 2 of the Fast and Furious firearms were recovered at the scene. And that's really what motivated Special Agent Dodson to come forward to Congress. Here, though, I think there is a strong argument to be made that this is worse because, as opposed to 2,500 firearms, and some were used in multiple crime scenes, potentially millions of fentanyl pills. We have been educated for the last few years by the DEA that one pill can kill. Of course, these were not flowing south into Mexico. They're flowing north all throughout the country. And so I think that really highlights, as you look at what wreckage fentanyl has caused across our country over the past several years, at what a serious scandal this really is.
Okay. Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about what you just mentioned with a little bit earlier. Because fentanyl is so lethal, the Trump administration did really step up efforts and basically said that during the Trump administration, first Trump administration, that to make all reasonable efforts to seize this. That was part of the DOJ policy then. There was a process that changed right during the Biden administration, and I guess particularly under the New Mexico U.S. Attorney, but there's also a policy-wide issue, right?
That's right. So you really have two different developments there. So at the time that Special Agent Howell came forward, the Justice Department was operating under the 2019 fentanyl protocols. And so they're really, you look at emails from the time, and even after Special Agent Howell seized fentanyl, got chastised by the U.S. Attorney's Office, but then applied for a wiretap renewal, Justice Department headquarters was asking some pretty piercing questions, saying it seems like there are large amounts of fentanyl involved. What's happening here? Did you have any opportunity to seize? Do you know where it's being stored? Other questions like that. And they requested, before approving the wiretap extension, that the folks in New Mexico really answer a lot of these questions. And you could tell that it kind of irritated the New Mexico U.S. Attorney's Office personnel. And they really kind of glossed over the fact that they had chastised Special Agent Howell for seizing the fentanyl. After Special Agent Howell blew the whistle and filed his whistleblower disclosure, there was ultimately a broader policy change. And so again, given how strictly the fentanyl protocols were enforced in 2023, we are still trying to figure out what was behind that policy change in 2024. But before the required report came out from the Justice Department in response to Special Agent Howell's disclosures to OSC, and OSC has the legal authority to require a report from DOJ, the Justice Department changed its entire policy to give much more latitude and discretion to U.S. attorneys' offices, and then really in part pointed to that in their OSC response, saying, well, for one, we interpret the old protocols, even though they say you should seize it whenever possible, that means it gives them some discretion. So that must mean you can also not seize it whenever possible. Clearly, we disagree on what it means to say whenever possible, whenever practicable. But the new policy just said you have to weigh public safety against walking these materials, and it's up to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So all of the discretion that had been taken away after Fast and Furious from U.S. Attorney's offices, and then with these fentanyl protocols, was clearly given back to them with this 2024 Biden Justice Department guidance change.
Yeah, and key here too is that when the Special Agent Howell made his whistleblower complaint, the Trump protocols about seizing it whenever possible, that was still in place. It was only after that whistleblower complaint that the DOJ thought it's a good idea to make a change on this to sort of blunt the whistleblower complaint. Is that sort of the timeline we're looking at?
That's the timeline. You can read kind of one of three things into that. The Justice Department has claimed that they were already in the process of updating that guidance, but we have seen no evidence of that to date. So it seems like either this is a practice that was starting to happen more, and they just changed their guidance to kind of acknowledge that, or U.S. Attorney Ubaez in New Mexico persuaded them that this was a better approach, or they didn't think it was a good approach, but they just did this as a CYA move to blunt the impact of David Howell's whistleblower disclosure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you anticipate that the Trump administration, the current Trump administration, is going to rescind the Biden policy that was put in place in 2024 post whistleblower and just go back to what was the original policy protocol in place for seizing fentanyl?
We certainly hope so, and we've been vigorously advocating for them to do that. I think it's been kind of clear to us there's a little bit of a push and pull tension between the DEA and the Justice Department, where most of the DEA still is in the hands of the same career law enforcement officials that were a part of this and that allowed it to go on. I think there seems to be a clear kind of defending what they've done in the past, even though there's really an argument to be made that they were entirely at the mercy of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And again, the former Biden U.S. Attorney, Alex Ubaez, is out very publicly defending what they did with this policy. But given the parallels to Fast and Furious, we hope that others at the Justice Department who have seemed very sympathetic will be able to kind of carry the day in getting this policy changed and going back to a situation where agents are required to, most of the time, seize fentanyl, unless there are very rare circumstances where they can track it, where they can still ultimately stop it and still do what they need to do in order to try and take down larger trafficking networks.
Okay. Well, the as far as the U.S. Attorney, Biden's U.S. Attorney, who was appointed in New Mexico at the time of this policy, he had stated that this was justified. It was to get the big fish, were his words. And wanted to ask, based on what we know, based on what you've seen, the stated motivation for this was to, bring down the big drug trafficking organizations and the kingpins and so forth. Is there evidence that they made a lot of arrests and brought down major trafficking organizations because of this operation and because of allowing the fentanyl walking into the U.S.?
So I think there's kind of two different ways to look at it, both in terms of Special Agent Howell's case and then in terms of other cases. So in Special Agent Howell's cases, because he seized fentanyl and the U.S. Attorney's Office was upset about that, they refused to charge his cases. So in this case, the tactic where he did it some of the time, but then they prohibited him other times, they didn't take down anybody in those cases. There was no kingpin or anything else. And again, those cases allowed fentanyl to go free as well. Other cases, I think, really raised some larger questions. So after Special Agent Howell was completely out of the loop, he wasn't allowed to go into the wire room anymore to listen to the intercepts. He was really kind of frozen out after his OSC complaint. If you looked at the Associated Press story by Jim Mustian, he quotes a retired DEA supervisor who continued to be in the loop in the Albuquerque office. And that individual points to a case that was taken down in May of 2025 at the beginning of the Trump administration. So Attorney General Pam Bondi actually had DEA agents and I think assistant U.S. attorneys flown out to D.C. to announce the largest fentanyl seizure in American history, which of course just happened to be in Albuquerque. Now that we know what we know, I think it's not surprising that much fentanyl had accumulated in Albuquerque on the one hand, but even worse than that, the AP article quoted this retired DEA supervisor as saying two things. One, even in that case, where there was such a large seizure, he said that case could have been taken down 6 months earlier. So again, this is post the Biden protocol change. So this really becomes the new policy. I don't know that there's any reason that the incoming Trump administration would have to know of these real changes or that Pam Bondi would have had any idea what the tactics were in this case on the ground. But, again, this DEA supervisor is saying this case could have been taken down much earlier. There was a November seizure associated with that case in Albuquerque. And it appears that might be close to the timeline when they could have taken down the entire ring, including the person who was the head of the trafficking ring. So they did arrest him and a number of others. But again, what you're hearing from law enforcement is, well, we could have arrested him anyway. We had what we needed. In the meantime, he says, every month that this case was up, that same amount of 3 million was being trafficked through New Mexico. So if the case went on 6 months too long, that's potentially 12 million fentanyl pills that this second agent, not our client, is suggesting could have been stopped from being trafficked into the United States. So again, this is not an either or. You can either get the kingpin or you can seize the fentanyl. There are ways of seizing fentanyl without alerting the network to the existence of the wiretap. It is riskier. There's no question of that. And again, back to David's case, that is part of the trade-off. Wasn't just we're going to not seize so we can get the higher level people. It really is more basely driven by we're going to not seize so people don't become aware of our wiretaps. And again, at a certain point, you have to just say, is the juice worth the squeeze, even for these lower level people, to not prosecute a case, to not have someone become aware of a wiretap. If you're not going to be getting up towards the top of the organization anyway, you are totally missing the forest for the trees.
Okay, got it. And probably the flip side of that question is, regarding how successful this was. Is there any tracking as to how many people might have died from just allowing so many of these fentanyl pills into New Mexico or into the United States, compared with how much success you've had in terms of, or the government had in terms of prosecuting cases?
There's no way to know at all, unlike firearms where you had a serial number that they could be traced with. So they might have been used in multiple crimes before they were left at a crime scene, but at least you could track where they were finally recovered. With fentanyl, there are no serial numbers. So just forensically, there's no way to identify those. Special Agent Howell paid close attention to where he heard about overdose deaths and other things after they allowed large amounts of fentanyl to be walked. And so he, for instance, tracked the death of a young infant just from who was exposed to some fentanyl on some tin foil, some aluminum foil. But there's not any way to know. And similarly, we don't know where those pills might have gone. They most certainly did not stay in New Mexico. They come through as part of their being trafficked throughout the United States. The Sinaloa cartel, which these pills were trafficked as part of, has really kind of part of, I think, the bulk of the fentanyl trade in the U.S. And so, although we don't know the exact corridors, the case that was taken down in May was clearly kind of an Intermountain West one where the head of the network had moved up to Oregon. They were going through Nevada. They were going through Utah. But again, at the same time, we don't know that wasn't also a route that allowed them to go onto highways that go across the entire United States and end up as far away as even here in West Virginia, which has been one of the hardest hit states in the country in terms of fentanyl in the last couple of years. So there's no way to know where they went, where the pills went, or what deaths resulted from them.
That's one thing I did want to ask about. And New Mexico obviously has gotten the most attention, and that's where the pills that we know of went. But how widespread was this policy? How many other? I mean, I guess that's what we might find out with his Inspector General investigation. But how widespread? Do we have any idea in terms of how far beyond New Mexico this went?
No, Special Agent Howell only had insight into New Mexico, but we are seeing kind of two things happening. And again, keep in mind the impact, on the one hand, you've got the impact of where even decisions in New Mexico, where that could have led to fentanyl traveling around the country. Then you've got the question of, okay, are there other states, other districts in the country that allowed this tactic as well? Many of the other states we've talked to were really shocked by this. I spoke yesterday with somebody who was the former criminal chief in a U.S. Attorney's office in a kind of bordering the border state, if you will. So just kind of north of there, not directly on the border, but who was saying that this was shocking, that they never would have seen something like that or allowed that either on the original protocols or even the changed Biden protocols, that they were still very careful. But I am also hearing rumblings that others are starting to come forward to say, no, in this state and that state, it may have happened as well. And again, given that there was a change that went across the entire Justice Department, I would frankly be shocked if others didn't somewhat pick up that tactic themselves after 2024.
Okay. Something I did want to ask you about, and that's the after this news broke about this whole Biden administration DOJ scandal and how it was handled. Initially, we did see President Trump. He blasted out a True Social about this. Clearly, he did not approve. He saw it as probably just another mishap within the Biden DOJ. However, after that, we saw the DEA come out with a somewhat quasi-defense of this, sort of a institutional defense, I suppose. And then we did see after that, though, we did see the head of the DEA, chief, call for an inspector general report investigation into this. So that's some progress. Do you think there has been some mixed messages from the administration on this?
Oh, undoubtedly. And, again, I think one thing to keep in mind goes back to what I said earlier about kind of tension within the Justice Department, maybe particularly between DEA personnel and Main Justice personnel. Again, keep in mind, in a new administration, a president gets to appoint 4,000 people. The other 2 million employees are career employees who stay there, and law enforcement agencies have fewer new people appointed than other agencies. So, you get a new DEA administrator, but the heads of field offices, their personnel in those offices, those are all staffing decisions that are, again, are filled with career employees. And so, I think there's no doubt in my mind that those career employees want to defend and cover, defend what they did, whether you consider that a cover up or not. I think there's also a couple of other things to keep in mind, which is that if the Justice Department or DEA did come out and acknowledge that this tactic was used, the potential liability is immense. And you see, as New Mexico's governor came out and called for billions in reparations from the federal government, that's just a small taste of where other states, municipalities, might, if the Justice Department officially acknowledged, hey, this was our policy, might come forward and say, hey, you owe us a lot of money because we've suffered the consequences of this. So I do have to wonder if there's any scenario where the Justice Department or any component would allow itself to admit this is what we did because of the doors that might open, given so many American deaths. Again, in Fast and Furious, it was mostly deaths in Mexico, which is still tragic. Sure. Any human being, any life lost, I think is very significant. But again, it was only really one American that suffered a loss of life in that case. Here, there are potentially thousands or more. But again, not something that I think you're likely to see the DEA want to admit liability for.
Okay, got it. Well, we do see that, yeah, as you mentioned, the governor of New Mexico, the Attorney General of New Mexico, a Democrat, is investigating this, possibly for criminal issues involved in this. We also, again, the Justice Department's Inspector General is looking into it. And occasionally an IG report really does break through things. Do you anticipate either of these investigations producing accountability on this?
I don't know about the New Mexico state report. I think that raises some very interesting questions about, absolute immunity of the federal government and of qualified immunity for law enforcement agents. I should say sovereign immunity for the government, not absolute. But that is difficult to overcome. But certainly, I hope the Inspector General report will be helpful in identifying more of how this happened, and particularly what the rationale was behind the 2024 policy change, whether that was something that was purely a response to Special Agent Howell's disclosures or not. I do think that there's a lot more that will come out in the meantime. IG reports take a long time, usually on average a year and a half. Even if it were a year from now before we got answers, that's difficult. And of course, one of the persistent questions of really all modern politics is, what is accountability anymore? So, after Operation Fast and Furious, you had Attorney General Eric Holder held in contempt of Congress for refusing to produce documents to Congress. And he was the first cabinet member to ever be held in contempt of Congress. But that's different from, again, that was really a procedural thing, not being willing to produce materials to Congress. It wasn't about the underlying action, and certainly not something like criminal charges. And I think more and more, many Americans are saying, you see every time I open X, they say, oh, another strongly worded letter, people criticizing, and I think that's difficult because our system is not as amazing as our constitutional system of government is. It is not really set up to create criminal accountability for the types of things that might happen in public office. It's more about public accountability. So people being identified and then, being voted out of office, including for, people who come in and kind of clean house. But so again, what constitutes ultimate accountability is difficult when you look at the possibility that multiple Americans, many of them might be dead because of a certain policy. I think for many, it might be hard to convince them that anything that happens as a result of this would be true accountability.
Okay, right. This might be getting into the weeds a little bit, but I guess short of prosecution, given the qualified immunity, would the state prosecutors still have the capacity to depose, I guess, former federal prosecutors or, in this case, that might have been handling the policy?
You get in some legal issues there that are not my expertise, and frankly, I'm not sure that anybody would be truly expert at them. It might be a question of what a federal judge would require. Again, I think it's probably a pretty high bar to get there because often just government conduct is presumed to be legitimate. And so, one of the things that is interesting is if you look at what the DEA's initial statements said and what the DEA administrator said, it was in part, we did everything according to policy. And so even if a policy technically allowed this, even under the Trump policy, where it did say consult with the U.S. Attorney's office, some other things like that. So even if you agree that there was a little bit of latitude there, whether or not this was prohibited by Justice Department policy or certainly by criminal law is different from the question of whether this was a good idea. And I think just this is one of those instances where the public instinct, often helps to course correct. Again, in Operation Fast and Furious, multiple levels of law enforcement officials and prosecutors believed that it was a good idea to sit back with these guns, even though they knew they weren't watching where they went precisely. They knew they were just going south of the border and they had no control over them. And I think the public response to that, again, must have been really a gut check for some of those individuals. I think you see a similar thing here, that some people that have very vigorously defended this policy are going to see that the public, which bears the costs and consequences of these government decisions, views it very differently because their communities are on the line. Their families' lives are the ones that have been lost.
Okay. Do you think do you expect Congress to get involved in investigating this?
Yeah, we are already working with one congressional committee. I don't want to identify who to give them the latitude to conduct their investigation and make it public at their leisure. But We are talking with Congress about it. They have already interviewed some of the personnel, and again, I think that
Okay.
there's a lot more that's going to continue to come out, including additional whistleblowers, as well as more details about some of these cases, like the 3 million takedown case from May of 2025.
Okay. And all right. So I mean, it does sound like we're potentially, the open-ended question about accountability that could be as simple as naming and shaming and public reports out there, the people who are behind this kind of policy.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it will be straightforward to identify the U.S. Attorney's Office personnel in New Mexico, whether various DEA personnel cheered on the policy, or, even if they didn't like the policy, if they are retaliating against people for speaking up against it, that's clearly very problematic as well. So I think you're going to see a lot of that. And of course, to me, a very big question is who was behind the decisions to change the policy in 2024 under the Biden administration to allow any office to utilize these tactics.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this. Is there anything else you would want to add?
We're just very grateful for David Howell's courage in coming forward. Patriotic whistleblowers, are the key often to uncovering these kinds of government scandals. And there is a toll that it takes. There is a cost to them, but we are confident that he has done the right thing here in exposing this, and that a lot of people are grateful for him doing so. And so we hope that this will encourage other whistleblowers, when they become aware of other wrongdoing, to be willing to step forward.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Fred.
much.